Hi, good evening, and welcome to the ZP FoodSense weekly webinar. So today's the 27th of October 2024. With that said, let me just jump in. Let me jump straight into it. So what I want to do is I want to just go through the questions that have come in during the week. So let me jump into it. So just FYI, I realize I haven't updated this, but there is a new larger webinar coming up. Make sure I'll update the link so that you can find that new large and upcoming webinar. Though saying this when I say large upcoming webinar, what I mean by that is we do a deep dive into the science of it. We do quite a number of demos. We talk about solubility of capsaicin and talk about a lot more of the science. With that said, we've got quite a few things to kind of get through now, so I don't really want to kind of stop and talk about too much about this. So we've got some questions today that have come in. I'm a little bit confused on some of these questions, but I will certainly do my best. It's probably worth just saying that I've got an awful lot of stuff with me. I've got like whole chilies with me. I've got some chili oil with me, so I'm going to be discussing that as well. And I've also got some ginger shots that I will also be discussing in a bit as well. So just know that there's a lot of technologies and hardware in front of me, and this will all be covered today. So the first question that's kind of coming in here is it normal to have results vary if the same sample is tested? The answer is no, it's not normal. Normally, I would expect that if you tested 3 times, maybe you get what's called a relative standard deviation of about 15%. So often if we test, and these samples are often very heterogeneous, so even if you think you are doing the same sample, you're not really, because chili samples are never just pure liquids. They're often a sort of suspension of fine powder or something like that. But getting a relative standard deviation of 15% is fairly reasonable if you do 3 measurements. So I don't quite understand this data, but for example, if these were meant to be the same sample and one of them was 8,770 and the other was 2,860, no, bang, that's really wrong. If something's 5,780 versus 4,070, that's sort of borderline, let's say. 2,650 and 3,010. Now you'll see in a bit that that's actually a very marginal difference. Something that as maybe people don't realize is that Scoville heat unit, what's happening is that the parts per million, you have what's called parts per million of capsaicin. And to go from parts per million of capsaicin into Scoville heat units, you actually times by 16. So it exaggerates all the differences. Scoville heat units exaggerates all the differences between 2 samples by a factor of 16, because it's got this ridiculous kind of conversion in it. So first of all, ask yourself a question. Do you really know what Scoville heat unit really means? And I actually would answer that most people actually don't know what Scoville heat unit really means. It's very confusing, because really what it is, it's come from this organoleptic test invented by Wilbur Scoville. And if you watch this rest of this webinar, actually I will dig into that. And these days it's become an analytical measurement for the amount of capsaicin in a sample. So what it means today and where it started from are 2 different things. But in order to try and link the historical with what happens today, they actually have this conversion factor of times it by 16. When you think about it, so it makes you think, oh, 2,650, that's very different from 3,010. That's a difference of, just doing a quick bit of maths over the top of my head, 360 Scoville heat units difference. Actually, that 360 was really only about 25 difference. It just got times by 16 because of this ridiculous unit conversion. Watch the rest of this webinar, you'll start becoming a bit more clear. The machine measures dihydrocapsaicin and Nordihydrocapsaicin. Just FYI, Homocapsaicin is not considered. So there's another way of measuring the Scoville heat unit of products. I don't think Homocapsaicin is actually in many chili products. The order of things is capsaicin makes up about 70% of the product. 20% of the product is dihydrocapsaicin. Less than 10% is Nordihydrocapsaicin, and Homocapsaicin is not considered because it's too small amount. So just FYI, you've got to be very careful with these questions, because people can end up down a rabbit hole and actually the question whether we consider homocapsaicin or not. If we considered homocapsaicin, we would be out of step with, let's say, the rest of the analytical world. Question number C, really, if your sample is an oil like this, that's only doing you favors, to be honest with you. The reason I say it's only doing you favors is because the oil is, very good at solubilizing the capsaicin. So it doesn't enhance the signal in any way. It just makes the sample prep much easier. So if your sample happens to be very oily, that's a good thing, because you've basically you've already put the capsaicin mostly into the liquid phase, because capsaicin, as you will discover, and you probably do know from our webinars, the capsaicin is an organic material. It loves organic solvents, it loves oils, and so it does help us actually make a better measurement, because it's already done a very good extraction of the capsaicin. So oil is not a hindrance. It doesn't enhance the signal. It just makes it easier to do the measurement because the capsaicin is already solubilized. What is our accuracy compared to HPLC? I'd like to spin this on its head and actually say that I'm going to show you some data where HPLC houses do not compare well to one another. So there's a thing. If high performance liquid chromatography, was such a great method for measuring the Scoville heat unit of chili products, I've got some chilies in front of me today. If HPLC was the great method, then there would be no FoodSense Generation 4. But in fact, there is a problem. It's expensive, and actually I'm going to demonstrate to you that it's no way the accuracy that people otherwise believe it to be. And a lot of people who ask this question actually don't use HPLC. So, but let me talk about HPLC as part of this webinar today. How do we determine which dilution factor is more suited for our oil-based samples? I will probably do a demonstration, or I can show you some data like that. You do not need to determine it. The app will tell you. This app will tell you if your sample is too concentrated. I suspect that, I'll do some testing today, but when I'm testing things like these chilies, I have to do a 1 in 100 dilution. This oil, if I was testing this, is probably on the border between doing 1 in 10 and 1 in 100, but I'd have to test it in order to find out. But let me get to that, I think, by doing a demonstration. This is a good question. I will deal with this now. Chilies are very heterogeneous. Here's a bunch of chilies that I've got here. Not one of these chilies will have the same amount of capsaicin in it. So this person's asking a very good question, actually, which is, if your sample is very heterogeneous, how small a sample can you take in order to actually get a meaningful result? And it's really hard, because if a sample is homogeneous, it doesn't matter. You can take one sample and it represents the population. This person understands their sampling statistics. They say, if I take one tiny sample, how do I know that that represents the rest of the sample? And the answer is, you should probably measure, if you think you've got a very heterogeneous sample, you should measure it X number of times and actually average the results and do plus or minus the relative standard deviation. But I'll talk through that by blending up some chilies in a bit, and we'll maybe use that to kind of help guide that conversation. Oh, yeah, this is correct. This is a good question, see, and this is something that, this is not the same person as asking question 1 or the same person asking question 2. This is a different person who's been watching our webinars for a while, and they really asked the really good question. Is it really sensible to actually report Scoville heat units as a number, or should you actually report it as a range? And I know you all have heard me say this millions of times, tens, hundreds of times on this channel. Here we are. Here's a good example of a large company that has a, probably over 100-year reputation. I was looking at it, it's even got the coat of arms of the royal family on the back of it, which is not bad for a US company, considering that this is a UK symbol on the back of a US company's product, so they should be proud of themselves. Anyway, that said, they ship this in the range 2,000 to 5,000 Scoville heat units. What does that tell you? It tells you that a leading brand owner of a chili product thinks it's acceptable to ship between 2,000 and 5,000 Scoville units. What they're telling you is the human tongue is really not that sensitive. Most people can't tell the difference whether they ship this at 2,000 or 5,000. In fact, how many online forums are there when they say, oh, that Tabasco sauce I just ate was hotter than last time? People don't realize that this product is shipping between 2,000 and 500,000 Scoville heat units. So it's actually a little bit, this person in asking the question is correct. People, you're better off actually thinking of your product as a range rather than as an absolute number. And I will have a bit of a conversation about the original Wilbur-Scoville test today in this webinar right to discuss that. Question number 4, somebody, most people who are using the FoodSense Generation 4 are actually using it to test capsaicin, but this particular person is really is not interested in capsaicin. They actually want to measure the amount of gingerol in a ginger shot. It's kind of interesting actually, because I realise that even though I'm shaking this up, there's still a lot of material precipitated at the bottom of this, so it'll be interesting to test that shortly. Okay, so let's go forward a little bit faster. First of all, their first question, where question 1A was, they had, if you've got big differences, what I would say is, I would like to if I measured a sample 3 times and I did the average and I calculated the relative standard deviation, which is simple enough to do. If you struggle with that, I could do a webinar on it, but I'd like that relative standard deviation to be better than 20%. I'd like it to be 15%. Now, if you get something grosser than that, then, you know, we've got a problem, let's say. I think some of your differences are definitely bigger than are very much bigger than that. But if I test this oil, I like to test it 3 times. I'll get 3 measurements. I'd like to average them, do the relative standard deviation. And I like that relative standard deviation to be 20%. Ideally, I'd like it to be 15%. Now, you were asking about dihydrocapsaicin, Nordihydrocapsaicin, and Homocapsaicin. So the reason I first of all say that, you know, obviously at ZP, we're very familiar with the alternative methods of measuring capsaicin. So we measure it using the FoodSense Generation 4, which I've got in front of me. If you're not familiar with the FoodSense Generation 4, this is it. It's a really super simple way of actually measuring Scoville heat unit. Much simpler than the methodology that I'm showing on the screen at the moment. But I bring up this method because it's worth noting that, in fact, in these methods, nobody's measuring homocapsaicin. So you've got to... homocapsaicin is a bit of an opinion because you can never say with certainty with natural products, but homocapsaicin is very much a minor player in the capsaicins that actually appear in chilies. The 2 dominant ones are capsaicin and dihydrocapsaicin, with Nordihydrocapsaicin playing a very minor role. And I mean, I definitely have read these documents. I mean, and actually got my head around this, just FYI. They say that normal capsaicin is kind of, it's approximately 50% of the hotness of capsaicin or dihydrocapsaicin. I just want to do a quick, let's say, model for you here. So let's imagine that you had a puree made up of 0.1 capsaicin. It was 100% capsaicin. That puree would have a Scoville heat unit of 16,000. That's, you know, fairly reasonable. So I'm saying, okay, somebody's made up a puree of chilies, 0.1% of it is capsaicin. That would have a hotness of 16,000 Scoville heat units. If that same puree was actually made up of dihydrocapsaicin, it would actually have a hotness of 15,000 Scoville heat units. I absolutely dare you to try and find the difference between, by tasting, the difference between 16,000 and 15,000. Remember what I said earlier on about this Tabasco? This Tabasco is shipped with a range of 2,000 to 5,000 Scoville heat units. So when people start saying, oh, well, is my product 16,000 and 15,000 Scoville units? Your end user won't know the difference. So it tells you a little bit about actually sometimes when people start sort of getting into, well, how much of the heatness is coming from capsaicin or dihydrocapsaicin? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's in the noise of humans' perception, let's say. So if you made a product with 100% of the heat coming from capsaicin, it would be 16,000. If you made the same product with 100% of the heat coming from dihydrocapsaicin, it would be 15,000. When in reality, actually, most products are actually more like, an extreme, you may have 50-50 capsaicin. In that case, that product would be 15,500 Scoville heat units. So I'd like you to be able to taste the difference between something that was 15,500 Scoville heat units, 15,000 Scoville heat units, and 16,000 Scoville heat units. You will not be able to tell the difference. Let's say it was more like a 70%, 30% capsaicin versus dihydrocapsaicin. That the hotness of that particular product would be 15,700 Scoville heat units. You will not be able to tell the difference. So I'm showing you by changing the ratio that, in fact, you know, and if we went to 80-20, which is also quite a common ratio, that might be 15,800 Scoville heat units. So why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because most chili products may have a ratio of 70% capsaicin, maybe 20% dihydrocapsaicin, and everything else is, you know, Nordihydrocapsaicin or something else. But actually, it makes very little difference to the Scoville heat units, actually. And you can see it here where I've messed around with these ratios quite considerably. And look how much difference it makes, you know, like 300 Scoville heat units by going from 50% capsaicin to 80% capsaicin. It really makes no difference. So be very careful about sort of digging into details. But when you actually think about how these details really affect the actual end user experience, which is a customer eating something, it makes really very little difference. Oil testing. Oil is your friend when it comes to FoodSense Generation 4. The reason I say that oil is your friend, when I look at this particular sample, it's got something in the bottom of it, which I presume is chilies, but it's been sitting in oil for a very long time. So that actually makes it really easy. I've got a vortex in front of me. I'm just going to pull the vortex in, well, only slightly into video, but I'm, whoops-a-daisy, turn it on. I'm just going to vortex this up just real quick. Turn my vortexer off. So that's vortexed it up a bit, but not that much. What I'm going to do is I just want to kind of make a mental make a mental point. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab out of this 100 microliters, which I will do now. So let me grab 100 microliters of this. So I've got my 100 microliters. I'm just going to put it in this little vial here, which I've done. Right. It might get a little bit messy here because I've got so much stuff in front of me. But I'm just going to put that down for a second while I just grab 900 microliters of buffer, because in the end we have a very distinct strategy that when we're preparing samples, we'll do like a 1 in 10 dilution, or 1 in 100 dilution, or 1 in 1000 dilution, or 1 in 10,000 dilution, but very rarely do we do 1 in 10,000 dilutions. It's just one of our customers is a Guinness Book of World Record holder for the hottest chili, so he does actually need a particularly hot a particularly high dilution. And now I'm just going to take 900 microliters, which I will do. I will put it into my sample, which I will do. And then I'm just going to vortex this up real quick. The reason I'm doing this is because in the end, the oil makes no difference to the makes no difference to the sample. See, the oil is just such a small fraction of the entire sample that it doesn't matter whether in the end this is an oil or a paste or chopped up chilies. It's dominated. 90% of this sample is actually dominated by our buffer. So what actually goes onto a sensor is not your oil, but it's your oil extracted into 9 volumes of our actual buffer. So I'm trying to make the point that oil is just a friend here, because the oil is actually going to help solubilize that capsaicin into our buffer. It's not really, well, it's not inhibiting our testing. It's actually helping our testing, but it helps it through the capsaicin. But it's not enhancing our signal. Our signal doesn't care whether you've got oil there or not. All our signal is how much capsaicin is actually in the sample, in the buffer. What the oil does is help transfer capsaicin into the buffer, but it just speeds up the sample preparation. It doesn't, therefore, doesn't help with enhancing our actual signal. Our actual signal is just the capsaicin itself. So you asked me a question and I've answered it. Then I'd say that because we do this particular 1 volume of oil in 9 volumes of buffer, or if it's very hot, they'll end up being in 99 volumes of buffer, at which point the oil is basically hardly present because most of it's actually the buffer. So testing oils is actually one of our, let's say, I don't say easy because that would make it sound really trivial, but it's actually one of the preferred sample types because in fact it's so easy to test. In fact, the Tabasco sauce is an easy one to test because in fact this ends up also being quite a sort of oily material, and actually that really helps because all the capsaicin is already so solubilized in it. Now, the next question is a really important one because people, when we first started with the FoodSense Generation 4, and we literally have started this now 7 years ago. Generation 4 means we're on the 4th generation of this. We were also really obsessed with HPLC testing. HPLC testing, high performance liquid chromatography, used to be known as high pressure liquid chromatography, but they didn't like the pressure bit because it suggested it was dangerous, which is probably the case. It's high performance liquid chromatography. At ZP, we actually have a lot of customers who were very keen on this correlation with HPLC. So this is actually a test that we ended up doing in India, where they both tested on FoodSense Generation 4 and they tested on an HPLC system, and they got a correlation of 99% or 0.99. This was a different lab in a different country, and they also wanted to correlate with HPLC. So they did the same test, and they also got a great correlation. Now, I wasn't surprised we got a great correlation, but I've absolutely stopped trying to tell people that, that we will correlate very well with HPLC because we put a lot of work into it over the years, including independent, sorry about my coughing, independent academic papers have also been produced on this. But the reason I'm a little bit hesitant to get into this conversation these days is because what we've discovered is, if we compare, and I'm sorry, a little bit of a cough. What we've discovered is, if we compare one HPLC house with another HPLC house, the way the question is phrased is, how do we compare against HPLC? Let me rephrase the question. If you send a sample to one HPLC house, will it test the same as another HPLC house? And the answer is, if that was the case, then these two HPLC houses would actually follow this green line. So your question is, how do we compare against HPLC? And I would actually say we've put a lot of work into that. But what we've discovered is, if we were to compare two HPLC houses, which we've done here, they would follow this green line. But in fact, they actually follow this red line. They don't actually compare against each other. So I have stopped literally answering the question, how do we compare against HPLC houses? Because I've realized that if you send the same sample to different HPLC houses, you'll get the different results. So when we answer the question, how do we compare against HPLC? It really comes down to, how do you compare against the HPLC in my town, my country, or local to me? That doesn't mean that we will correlate, but if they measure it 50,000 and we measure 60,000, you'd say, oh, you're wrong, guys. And actually, it may be the HPLC house that's wrong. So this is independent data. Two HPLC houses, how do they correlate to one another? They don't correlate to one another, actually. So it's I think there's a lot of belief that HPLC must work, but that's a belief system, because actually most people who use HPLC for the testing of Scoville heat units actually is fine, have very little understanding of it. And it's actually mostly done on trust and belief. But if you actually did the study where you compared 3 different HPLC houses with the same sample, you would get 3 different results with quite a large standard deviation between them. And we've seen this in this particular study. So I have actually stopped answering the question, how do you compare against HPLC? Because I'm realizing HPLC doesn't compare well against itself. I think if HPLC was a perfect solution, then you wouldn't have actually a FoodSense Duration 4. I mean, the FoodSense Duration 4 is quick relative to HPLC. It's low cost. It's definitely easier to use. Whereas HPLC is kind of expensive to use, slow to do a turnaround. You get the results, but you have no transparency on those results. You never got you never did this experiment. You just get a certificate back, or maybe an email, and that's it. And it's believed. But actually, when you really dig into this, and at ZP now we've been doing this for 7 years, we have dug into it. Actually, I've stopped answering the question, how do we compare against HPLC? Because actually the answer is HPLC don't compare against HPLC. Now, question number 2 is a good question as well. Certainly some strong questions in question number 1. Question number 2 is really about sample size. And it's a fair question, so I'm going to actually answer it. In fact, first of all, I'll show the question because, how does 0.1 grams and 0.1 mils really represent the heterogeneous sample? And I think it's an absolutely fair question, actually. So I'll answer it by kind of going through a bit of a demo, actually. So let me just flick this open. I'm going to do this really quick and dirty, by the way, because these chilies have got their stalks on them still. So that, just FYI, I know you would never do that, but the stalks don't contain capsaicin. So effectively, I'm diluting the sample just by doing it effectively this way. But I really just want to get this, which I would describe as a very heterogeneous sample. I want to increase the sort of homogeneity of this a little bit. So let me just get these in there. That's probably up. No, I need to put that on. All right. Right, I'm only doing, if I start coughing, my apologies for this. I've already started coughing already this evening. But I'm doing it essentially for a good reason. So now, yeah, I'm definitely going to start coughing in a minute. All right. I've done it for this reason. Now I'm in a much more homogeneous situation. But you can absolutely see it. This is not a homogeneous situation. This is still very heterogeneous. And in fact, what I end up doing here is I've got a little balance in front of me, and I want to weigh out 0.1 grams. But we know something that this is a it's a heterogeneous sample. It's got bits in it. Those seeds actually also have a reputation for not containing capsaicin as well. I do realise that actually with the FoodSense Duration 4, we can actually confirm all of these assumptions, by the way. Because actually we could test the seeds alone. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slightly pick out some pieces now. But understand that in the process of picking pieces out, what I'm really doing is I'm actually doing a manual filtration here, because I know I'm picking, but I'm sort of improving the signal by actually only picking out the fleshy bits. I'm leaving the seeds behind. So you've got to be very conscious of what it is that I'm actually doing here. So sometimes we kind of we kind of like to just think, the instrument will take care of itself. But of course, when you send a sample to an HPLC, you have no idea what they're really doing. You can see the thought that I'm actually doing in answering this question. Is 0.1 grams really enough to is it really enough to kind of sample something that's quite a complex sample? I think the answer is, it's a fair question. I actually think the answer is no. But I'm just going to carry on picking these out for a second. In fact, yeah, all right, so I've overdone it slightly, so let me just pull that back a bit. All right, let me just come to, because of the demo, that's not too bad, 0.106 grams. All right, I'm going to hold this up now, and just so you can see it. I would argue that that's still, you could criticize me and say that's still quite chunky. So realistically, do this little sample represent this? And you know, I could definitely take the criticism that it doesn't. So what would I do in this situation? What I would do in this situation is, in fact, I may go a bit further with this, is actually prepare a sample, which I will now do. I'll just take the 0.1 grams, which I've now done. So 0.1 grams are in here, and I'm just going to put in, let me think, 0.9 milliliters of buffer. So let me just get that. So I'm just grabbing that buffer now. All right, I'll put that in there like that. So most food products are definitely very homogeneous. Sorry to keep saying homogeneous. I'm definitely trying to say heterogeneous. So in fact, I would actually prepare that sample, but statistically that 0.1 grams can't really represent everything else in that pot. It would be sort of statistically very unlikely that that was actually the case. But in doing that now, I've only used 0.9 mils of buffer. I've only used 0.1 grams of the sample. I'd actually test that, and I'd actually prepare at least another 2 of those and do it 3 times so that I get a better example of that. But you understand that if you take this sample and you picked out seeds, the sample with seeds in it is going to come back lower than the sample without seeds. So you've got to be really conscious of the way you're actually doing this work. So if I was testing whole chilies, first thing I would do is actually take the stalks off, which I didn't do, which was a deliberate thing, but I would take the stalks off because it's not fair to kind of have the stalk as part of the mass, because essentially the stalk doesn't have capsaicin in it. It'll end up increasing the mass, but therefore decreasing the concentration of capsaicin. And then when I'm actually taking the 0.1 grams, in my protocol, I'm making a conscious effort to actually not bring the seeds across, because again, they don't contain capsaicin as well. And then having prepared the first sample, I'd actually test it, and I'd actually end up testing at least another 2, so I had a triplicate. I'd really like to get to another 5. Now, if I do 5 like that, I can appreciate that I've ended up using essentially 4.5 mils of buffer, and I can understand the consciousness on cost. But 4.5 mils of buffer when we ship 500 mils of buffer is not that much, I would suggest. If I found out that in fact this was too hot, there's too much capsaicin in it, I would then take 0.1 mils of this and further dilute it with 0.9 mils of buffer. In fact, I might just do that now, just to say. So let's say I tested this and the meter said that there's too much capsaicin, which is probably is the case with a sample like that. Then I would probably take that sample. I would probably do what I'm about to do. The reason, and I'll just vortex it quick to homogenize it. Then I would take 0.1 mils of that, which I've just done, and I would put it in a further container like this, and then I would put that, I put 0.9 mils of buffer on top of that. So basically I've taken the 1 in 10 and I've diluted it down to the 1 in 100, which I'm now doing. Because by using this technique, I'm basically minimizing. It's much faster to do it this way, with pipettes, let's say. And also it's more conserving of the liquid reagents, or the buffers rather. So here's my new sample. I'll just give that a quick vortex, and that's probably with a complex sample, with a hot sample like a chili, like that. Then that's probably the way I would do it. Different video, just a side comment. People often think that their chilies are much hotter than they really are. It's because when they look up their chili hotness on the internet, what they're looking up is the dry weight. So the dry hotness of a pepper X is about 2.9 million Scoville heat units. The pepper X chili, when it's 90% water, is more like 290,000 Scoville heat units. So just FYI, I'm always getting this as a things are not as hot as I was expecting. It's like, no, you've looked up on the internet the dry weight Scoville heat unit for that particular chili. In fact, what you're measuring is the wet weight. So when I just did that process then, I was definitely measuring wet weight because it was the whole chili. All right, let's go on a little bit more. So this person makes a very good point that I would actually agree that 0.1 grams is not necessarily enough material to be statistically a big enough sample to actually represent that population. I think you need to test it in triplicate or 5 times, let's say. Don't forget that often with HPLC, people actually never even think about this. They just say, oh, I just send the sample and I get a result. Well, how's that sample representative of, everything else you're doing? And it's like, I've just never thought of it. And I was like, yeah, so it's a belief system often. So sample size, yeah, it needs to be, you do have to think about doing multiple tests in order to understand the heterogeneity. This is really a good question, this is actually. So somebody's been watching our webinars for a couple of weeks, and I appreciate it because they do appreciate the sort of scientific, let's say, rigor that we try to put into these things. So I appreciate the comment. And I've used this as an example already. First of all, that Tabasco doesn't ship at 2,500 Scoville heat units. It actually ships in a range of 2,000 to about 5,000 Scoville heat units. So people should really be thinking about characterizing their products or controlling their products in a range, not to an absolute number, because you can have quite the difference between 2,500 and 5,000 is it's 2.5. 2,000 by 2.5 is 5,000. So they one hell of a range on that product, but no human being can discern the differences. This fixation with absolute numbers is because actually very few people in the industry are really doing that much HPLC testing, but when they do it, they get an absolute number. That absolute number, by the way, has an error on it, but nobody's ever putting the error down. So anytime you make a chemical measurement or any kind of measurement, there's an error. Especially in chemistry, there's actually an error. So there's an error associated with this number, but people don't actually appreciate it. So people are very fixated now with absolute numbers, when actually I think they should definitely be thinking about ranges. And when you know the science behind these kind of numbers, actually you realize that there's definitely an error associated with it. Let's talk about the original. I'm going to come back to this idea of ranges in a minute, but let's talk about the original definition for Scoville heat unit was from the Scoville or the Wilbur-Scoville organoleptic test. And in that, they would have a capsaicin extraction. They would dilute it with some sweetener. They would give it to a panel of people. Let's say there were 5 of them. And when 3 of those people could no longer determine the hotness of, or determine the capsaicin or the pungency after a series of dilutions, when 3 of them could no longer discern that it was no longer pungent or it was pungent, then that was the Scoville heat unit. So you would start off with the idea that there's 5 people in a room. You gave them a diluted sample and all 5 said, yep, I can taste that. I can taste the hotness in that. So you take that dilution 1 and you further dilute it. And then one of the people says, well, after that second dilution, I can no longer taste it. So now you've got 4 people left. Okay. Then you dilute dilution 2 by a further dilution and get to dilution 3. And then you ask the remaining people to test it. One person drops out. Okay, that's great. And then actually do a further dilution. And then there's 2 people who say, I can still taste it. But at this point, you've lost 3 people. So 60% of the people say, after dilution 4, I can no longer taste this. So that means that the Scoville heat unit, therefore, is dilution 1 times dilution 2 times dilution 3 times dilution 4. So if I put some real numbers to that, 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 means that that particular sample would had a Scoville heat unit of 10,000. So this is where Scoville heat units originated. Let me kind of do another thought experiment. Let's take 5 people. Let's give them a product that we've diluted 100 times, and everyone says, I can taste it. This means this product is higher than 100 Scoville heat units. So you do another 20 dilution on it, and then one person drops out and says, I can no longer taste it. What does that mean then? That means that at 2,000 Scoville heat units, or 2,000 dilutions, one person can no longer taste the pungency. So then you do a further dilution on it. So let's say you dilute it 3 times. Sorry, 2 times. So 2,000 just became 4,000 dilution. So 100 times 20 times 2 is 4,000. At which point another 2 people drop out and only 2 people are left. At which point Wilbur Scoville would say, okay, the Scoville heat unit for that is actually 4,000, because by the time when we got to a 4,000 dilution, the remaining 2 people had dropped out. So, remaining 1 person dropped out. So 3 of 5 said, I can no longer taste this. So 5 went to 2 and 3 had dropped out by the time we got to 4,000 Scoville heat units. So in fact, Wilbur Scoville would therefore say that that was the definition of Scoville heat units. Now, let's say we diluted it just a bit more, like by 1.25, and then everyone says, no, I can no longer taste it. So everyone's dropped out. The way Wilbur Scoville did this, it basically means that he says, well, actually, 3 of the 5 people can no longer taste it after 4,000 Scoville heat units. Therefore, that is 4,000 Scoville heat units. But in reality, 1 person dropped out at 2,000, 2 people dropped out at 4,000, and 2 people dropped out at 5,000. It just happens, when I averaged that, I actually found out that the average of 1 person dropping out at 2,000, 2 people dropping out of 4,000, and 2 people dropping out of 5,000, the average of that was actually 4,000. It was accidental, but it kind of... So whether you use Wilbur's method, which said when 3 of 5 people have dropped out, that's the Scoville heat unit, which actually be 4,000. The way I did it was said, okay, actually, let's look at the absolute dilutions at which everyone dropped out. That also came to 4,000 as well. But if I just made one change, and that said that 2 people dropped out at 2,000, and then only 1 further person dropped out at 5,000, my average would actually be 3,400 Scoville heat units. I'm wondering, who's right here? Is it Wilbur Scoville who's right, who said, in order to determine the Scoville heat unit of a particular chili product, I will test a room full of people, and when 60% of them say they can no longer taste it, that's the Scoville heat unit. I would kind of say you actually measure at which dilution everyone dropped out, and you average it, and actually sometimes that comes to being the same number as Wilbur Scoville. But it seems to me that you're actually losing information by just saying, well, I'm just waiting for 60% of people to essentially say whether they can taste it or not. So who's right and who's wrong? But I got to, nobody's really right. But I would say the Wilbur Scoville way of doing it was actually very simple, but it's sort of, we could have lost 1 person at 100. We could have lost another person at, 2,000, etc. I was just saying that the real spread or range of people is actually lost in the Wilbur Scoville way of doing it, because there's actually a range here. And the range was that 1 person dropped out at 2,000, 2 people dropped out at 4,000, and 2 people dropped out at 5,000. But the Wilbur Scoville way of doing this would actually suggest that everyone dropped out at 4,000, which wasn't the case. You actually had a real range of 2,000 to 500. So I'm kind of wondering if really we should think about, actually, when we're doing Scoville heat unit, we could have an absolute number, let's say, but we should actually think of this in range. And actually what I would prefer to be doing something like is doing do 3 measurements on a sample, calculate the standard deviation, and then report that actually my result is my average of 3 tests plus or minus a standard deviation. It's a much fairer way of thinking about this, and probably represents the human experience better than this absolute number. And that number was never absolute, because actually the way the Wilbur Scoville system works is you keep diluting until you've only got 40% of people left, at which point you stop diluting. So that's not the same as saying, what was everyone's real experience here. So just FYI, I've been thinking about this a little while. The ridiculousness of the Scoville heat unit is actually this, that we actually run a unit from 0 to 16 million Scoville heat units. I was just thinking about this, thinking what else in this world actually runs on that, or in the universe runs on that kind of range. And it's actually the temperature, for example. So the temperature in this office now, it's 22 degrees Celsius, so call it 21 degrees Celsius. Do you know what the temperature in the core of the sun is? It's 15 million degrees Celsius. So it's kind of telling you that when you look at the when you look at the Scoville heat unit, you're looking at a scale that's like comparing the temperature of a air-conditioned room to the temperature of the core of the sun. So that's just how ridiculous this range is. So when people come to me and say, "Oh well, I measure 2,000 Scoville heat units," I'm actually showing you what that means, what percentage of the Scoville heat unit range that is. So when you say it's 4,000 Scoville heat units, yeah, it's double. Look, it's double. But that's what a small part of the range we're actually talking about. So I've got a super suspicion that people are really obsessed with, is my product 2,000 or 5,000 Scoville heat units? I actually think that most people can't actually tell a difference. And when you look at it on the absolute range of Scoville heat units, these are pathetically small percentages. And actually, I think that people should be a little bit more lenient with their, let's say, measurements. If I'm going to try and define a product, I would say make 3 samples, make 3 measurements, average them or calculate the mean of them, calculate the standard deviation, calculate the relative standard deviation by dividing the standard deviation by the average, and then report the average plus or minus the relative standard deviation. So I think the answer to this person's question is yes, actually people think that Scoville heat unit is somehow some sort of absolute number. In reality, there's always an error, and I think you're actually better off reporting it as a range. And one way of doing range is to do the average plus or minus relative standard deviation. Oh, last thing now, right. So what I'm actually going to do is, I've talked a lot about chilies this evening, but I'm actually going to do just one thing differently this evening. I said it'd be a bit messy here, so I'm going to pull a few things out. If you hear something drop down, it's probably because I've dropped something, but I'm basically just trying to clear myself a little bit of space. What I want to do is do a measurement. So most of the time we are measuring, my apologies, we are measuring chili. So I come up here, I scan my QR code, and now I can measure chili. Actually, what I'm going to do is, I just want to get this QR code here. Right, I'm actually going to measure ginger, and I'm being a bit cautious because I know I'll knock something over. So I'm just going to actually grab a slightly different modified sensor, which is a ginger sensor. I just pull one of these ginger sensors off, throw away this old guy here, put the ginger sensor in. I must admit, I've never actually tested this particular sample. Just going to get a little sample of this. So FoodSense Generation 4, we used to call it the chili pot, but then we started finding ourselves actually having a bit of a menu expansion. I mean, the vast majority of people actually use this to, that is pungent. Use this to measure the hotness of chili products, but it can also do the pungency of the pungency of ginger as well. So let me just, I'm thinking aloud, sorry. So I'm just going to make up a quick sample. I'll do a 1 in 10 dilution. So I'll take 0.1 microliters, put that in there. I need 900 microliters of buffer, which I will grab the correct pipette, which I will now do. As soon as you put it down, you then forget where you put it. There it is, good. Right. Just grab a pipette tip, and I will do this. And I realized something. Yeah, okay, cool. And I will grab some buffer, which I am now doing. Sorry if I'm sort of chanting to myself. It's just so I don't lose track of what I'm actually up to. And I will put that in there. All right. The nice thing about ginger shots are it's a bit like the chili oil discussion earlier on. The job's been done for us in some ways because it's already in the liquid phase. It's like ginger root is kind of like trying to test ginger powder, or ginger powder is like like chili powder. But these are all in the liquid forms. Okay, so I've got the sample there, I've got my sensor there, I've got my app here. I'm just going to give this a name. What's the name of this product? This product's called Moju. Okay, so no probs. Moju. I've never tested this product before, so this will be interesting. And I'm going to grab a 50 microliter pipette, and put 50 microliters on the sensor, which I will now do. And thinking aloud, yep, there it is. Right. Samples on. Continue. 1 in 10 dilution. I don't need to do 1 in 100, 1 in 1000, 1 in 10,000. Let's have a quick look now. As I say, I've not tested this sample before, so I can see the data coming in real time now. Just give me a sense of what I'm actually going to get at the end here. And now it's uploading it. It should do an analysis real quick. Yeah, so it's done the analysis. So I've got a result. So it really follows the same kind of workflow as a chili sensor. So in fact, it sends the result to the cloud. I'm really pleased actually, because they've put it in parts per million, which is a much more meaningful unit. Don't worry about the micromolars. The is micromolar. At ZP, we're pretty strong in our analytical chemistry, so we like a unit like that. But in fact, the ppm is much more meaningful to most people. So it's come back with 743 ppm. So I did that one at the end there because it's a little bit different from like the normal sort of chili stuff, let's say, we do at ZP. So I just want to change screens back again. Now that was really question number 4. So let me just finish off by saying thank you very much. So there were some tricky but good questions in question number 1 this evening. Things around oils, comparing against HPLC, and I know I take quite a strong stand on HPLC, but I've just realized that we put all this effort in to make sure we correlated with HPLC, which we did, and then we found out that HPLC doesn't correlate with itself particularly well. And I think that it's just really that, for example, in India, you can get HPLC done at like $20 a time, and that might be the case in other places in Asia. In Europe, that might take place at $100, $200, something like that. But realistically, it's very hard for companies to be making any kind of money at those kind of rates. So in fact, I think they're probably good engineers, good scientists running their equipment, but really they can't give these samples the attention that they would otherwise require, because the food industry is a kind of, it's quite a low margin industry. And in fact, running analytical equipment that's otherwise intended for the pharmaceutical industry, where the profit margins are fantastic, it's not good to run those kind of instruments in an industry where in fact the margins are just quite low actually. And so people kind of get these certificates of analysis, think that they must be great because they're coming from the lab, but in fact different labs will give you different results. The oil in those samples will help us. I would honestly want you to do, if you did 3 samples, and the relative standard deviation for me should be better than 20%, should be better than 15%. Question number 2, when you've got like that complex heterogeneous sample like that, rather than testing 1 gram of this, I would take 3 0.1 grams and do 3 measurements and end up doing the average and the relative standard deviation of that and seeing what that looks like. Question number 3 really was asking about ranges. So I think it's actually better to think about your product in a range, and not actually absolute numbers. And this thinking of absolute numbers comes from these certificates of analysis. But if you really look at the way Wilbur Scoville actually defined Scoville heat units, where actually different people were dropping out at different dilutions, he generally had a range actually in the way he did it, but they report it like an absolute number, when really I think a range is where this whole thing started from, is the way we should actually think of it today, especially when companies like this are actually shipping it with quite a range actually. 2,000 to 5,000 Scoville heat units, that's 2.5 times 2,000 is 5,000, so it's quite a variation, let's say, in that. But no criticism of the company, it just tells you that people are not so sensitive, and we should be thinking about what is it we're trying to do here, and it's probably just make a consistent product for the end user. And then question number 4, you can also use this unit for also testing the parts per million of gingerols also in ginger shots, which I just did at the end there. And I didn't dip into it on this particular one, but actually, whoops-a-daisy, I'm just running the test again. But we also get, the nice thing about it is actually the results actually got saved up to the cloud as well. So if you've got any questions for FoodSense Generation 4, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much.